Should you move to Singapore? If you're considering relocating to Singapore, make sure you watch until the end of this video to understand why you should or shouldn't move to Singapore. My name is Jen and welcome to my channel, Happy Hapa. For those of you that are new to my channel, I'm an Asian American young professional living in Singapore. I created this channel to not only document my experience living in Singapore, but also to share advice with all of you. I'm so happy that my video about the pros and cons of living in Singapore resonated with so many of you. If you haven't watched that video yet, I'll link it here so that you can check it out after watching this video. Now that I've lived in Singapore for almost 3 years, I wanted to make an updated video that shares my perspective on some of the additional benefits and disadvantages of living in Singapore. One of the best parts about living in Singapore is how incredibly convenient everything is. This is intentional because Singapore excels at urban planning. Each neighborhood is designed to be self-sufficient with grocery stores, doctor's offices, restaurants, and shops all within walking distance. For example, where I live, there are 3 different grocery stores less than a 5-minute walk away. Compared to where I lived in the US, getting to the nearest grocery store would take me at least 15 minutes by car. Another element of Singapore's urban planning that I really appreciate and that I think really contributes to the quality of life in Singapore is how green of a city it is. The greenery makes a huge difference in how hot and humid it feels in Singapore, and beyond cooling the environment and providing shade, aesthetically Singapore looks very visually appealing because of how much green there is. It's not a concrete jungle at all. I'm actually surprised that I didn't mention public transit in my first video because I talk about how much I love Singapore's public transit all the time. Singapore is ranked as having one of the world's best public transit systems, and it really shows. It's so easy to navigate that even tourists can immediately understand what train they need to take and which direction they need to go. Public transit is also really affordable. The vast majority of Singaporeans use public transit, and they don't even own a car because of how expensive it is. If you're interested in learning more about how much it costs to live in Singapore, I've recently made a video that I'll link about the cost of living in Singapore. Singapore is well known for being efficient and everything runs on a tight schedule. Trains and buses arrive every couple of minutes, so if you miss your train or bus, you don't have to worry because another one will be coming very soon. When you're moving to a new country, it can be really daunting figuring out all of the logistics and paperwork. I remember when I studied abroad in France in college, it took me almost a month to set up my bank account because each time I tried to visit the bank, they were either closed or on a very long lunch break. In contrast, setting up everything I needed for my life here in Singapore was extremely easy and fast. By the first week, I had already gotten my phone plan, opened a bank account, and gotten my visa. Everything was very straightforward, easy to understand, and the processing times were really fast. Another story that demonstrates this is recently I had to get my passport renewed, and I was really worried because in the US, I had heard that getting your passport renewed was taking almost 3 months after COVID. But to my pleasant surprise, it took less than 2 weeks to get my new passport, and I didn't even have to pay an extra fee for expediting the processing time. Singapore is a melting pot, and when people first learn about Singapore, they might not appreciate this. As a foreigner, many people think that because Singapore is in Asia, it's a relatively homogenous country, and in reality, it is much more nuanced than that. Singapore has 3 major races: Chinese, Indian, and Malay. There is a 4th category called Other, which is a catch-all for everybody else. Each of these communities in Singapore celebrates different festivals, and the public holidays in Singapore correspond to this. This is just one example of Singapore's diversity and multiculturalism, and it's been a highlight of living here, getting to experience so many different cultures. Singapore has excellent healthcare, and many people will travel to Singapore just to get their medical treatments done. Coming from the US, I was so relieved that Singapore had a healthcare system that was easy to navigate. As a foreigner, you will be using private healthcare, which is more expensive than the public healthcare system that locals get access to, but still compared to the US, it is much cheaper. And the quality of care that you get is world-class. Now on to some of the cons. Honestly, I did have a harder time thinking about these cons because overall, Singapore is such a great place to live, and I highly recommend it to anyone that is interested in living in Asia. But let's dive into some of the cons. A big one that I didn't include in my first video but got a lot of comments about is the weather. Singapore sits quite close to the equator, so the weather here is very hot and humid year-round. It rains a lot in Singapore, and the rain can be completely unexpected. It can go from being a beautiful sunny day to a really strong thunderstorm in just a matter of minutes. If you do like spending a lot of time outdoors, the weather can be a deterrent for moving to Singapore. This is somewhat related to the weather. Singapore's hot and humid climate means that mosquitoes are going to be very prevalent here. For some reason, mosquitoes love me, and it drove me crazy when I first moved here because I was constantly covered in mosquito bites. Maybe after acclimating here for a couple of years, I no longer get as many mosquito bites, but if you're spending time outdoors here, it's a good idea to wear bug spray and try to cover up. All of these mosquitoes does mean that there's a risk of certain diseases that mosquitoes carry, and here in Singapore, the big concern is dengue. In my neighborhood, in certain times of the year, I will see signs warning about the uptick in the number of cases of dengue and ways that we can try to stop dengue from spreading by preventing mosquitoes from breeding. A big misconception that I had about Singapore before I moved here was that because it's an island, I would be spending a lot of time on the beach and swimming in the ocean. After arriving, I realized that is definitely not the case. Singapore does have beaches, but one of the major reasons that people don't use them like they would in a vacation destination like Phuket or Bali is because of the tankers in the water. Singapore is a shipping and transport hub, and that means that the waters are constantly filled with tons of boats that are bringing and taking supplies. These boats unfortunately release a lot of oil into the water, and actually recently there was a collision which resulted in a large oil spill on Singapore's coast. For this reason, most people don't go swimming in the ocean, and instead they would opt for a pool. Singapore is known for shopping, and there's actually an entire part of town that is completely dedicated to malls called Orchard. It's a very long road that is just mall after mall after mall. As a minimalist, I dislike mall culture because I think it promotes overconsumption. I understand why malls are so popular here because they function almost like a third place where people can gather and spend time in an air-conditioned environment because it's so hot outside, and almost every neighborhood has their own mall. But once you step foot into a mall, there's an inherent pressure to buy. You can't just sit at a restaurant, you need to buy food. When you're browsing in a store, you feel pressured to buy an item. So this is a con that's a bit personal to me, and it might not bother others as much. In my previous video, I talked about how easy it is to make friends in Singapore. Almost 3 years later, I still think that's true. But now that I've been here for a couple of years, I have seen my fair share of friends come and go. In particular, many expats are here for work assignments that last a couple of years, so they know that they won't be here long term. This is actually probably why it's so easy to make friends, because people's friend groups aren't as permanent, and so there's more room for new people to join their groups. I don't think this is a huge con because I like meeting new people, and I found it very easy to make friends even when existing friends have moved away, but it might be something to consider for people that prefer to have a more stable, permanent friend group. So those were some additional pros and cons to consider before moving to Singapore. To make sure that you get the full picture, also watch my first video about 5 pros and cons of moving to Singapore. It's been super rewarding knowing that my videos are helping you in your move to Singapore. I've really enjoyed making these videos about being an expat and helping others with their move, so do let me know if there's any other topics that you'd like me to make a video about. Lastly, if you found this video helpful and you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing to help support my channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.